He was hit by an illegal alien driving. He ran back and forth over my son 3 times, trying to get away.
His son was a victim in the truest sense. Kate Stanley was a victim.
So today we have a special guest on the No Border, No Country podcast. It's Don Rosenberg, a longtime friend of both Early and our sister organization, FAIR, and he is the head of AVIAC. We'll be speaking with him about his advocacy on behalf of the victims of crimes committed by people unlawfully present in the United States.
Okay, we're joined today by Don Rosenberg. He's the president of AVIAC, which stands for Advocates for Victims of Illegal Alien Crime. Don, how you doing today? Thanks for joining us.
I'm good, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Okay, tell us, for people that may not be familiar, what is AVIAC? What's the motivation behind it? What kind of work do you do?
Well, AVIAC was formed in 2017. It was an organization where we wanted victims of illegal alien crime to be the controlling interest in the board. So 7 of us got together. Most of us had lost a child at the hands of an illegal alien. In a couple of instances, it was brothers. And we formed the organization to sort of do what we had all been doing all along anyway. I mean, my son was killed in 2010, so I've been working this issue since 2011, but because we finally had a friendly voice in the White House, we thought it was a good time to organize and work as a unit as opposed to, working individually. And, our main goal at the time was to work with other victims immediately after they had become a victim, because we all found the same thing was happening to all of us, and it didn't matter whether it was a liberal state or a conservative state, is that either law enforcement or the district attorneys, were screwing us over. They cared more about the illegal alien than they did us, and sometimes they didn't even know the person was illegal, and then they released them, and of course they disappeared. So we wanted to get to victims very quickly. That now has become practically impossible because the media just doesn't pick up on these stories. So we concentrate more on the other part, which is educating certainly politicians and the public on the truth about illegal immigration. That's pretty tough too. And I know we'll get into it later with a media that doesn't want to talk to people like us. They just want to hide what's happening. But we're out there every day. And we do work with victims. Much harder to find them because the media does not cover their stories. But that's what we do.
You did not start out in your adult life as an activist necessarily. Can you talk a little bit about Drew's story and the circumstances around it in the aftermath that are kind of fueling your passion for this project?
Right. Well, living in Southern California, you obviously know a lot about illegal immigration. But, I knew what was going on to some minor extent, but not to the breadth of knowledge that I have now. My son, Drew, was a second-year law student in San Francisco. I live outside of LA. He was up in San Francisco. And coming home from school late one afternoon, he was run over. He was on his motorcycle. He was hit by an illegal alien driving, who tried to flee. The hit did not kill my son. It was the attempted flee. People stopped him from fleeing, but he ran back and forth over my son 3 times, trying to get away. While we were told that day that the guy, or actually the next day that the guy was illegal, a few days later, I got a call from the San Francisco Police Department telling us that was a mistake. He was in the country legally. So for the first year, my advocacy was strictly based on unlicensed drivers. It had nothing to do with immigration status, even though it was obvious that illegal aliens were a big part of the unlicensed driver population. did a lot of radio shows and TV. And one night after doing a show, I got contacted by an ICE agent surreptitiously who told me, you keep saying the guy, I've heard you on different shows, you keep saying the guy that killed your son was here legally, and that's not true. He was an illegal alien from Honduras. He gave me all his background. I wasn't positive that this guy was an ICE agent. I had no proof, but he clearly knew way more than the average person would know. I mean, I did end up meeting him, and he was, genuine. And even after that point, because I was working with another individual on the issue of unlicensed drivers, and we had agreed not to get into the illegal alien part of it because we would be shut down in LA. But after a while, I mean, what kind of probably set me off, I was testifying again about unlicensed drivers in front of the LA Police Commission. And one of the commissioners said to me, and this is maybe 12, 13 months after my son was killed, I'm sorry you lost your son, but Jose, and I don't remember what the guy's name was, but it wasn't Jose, but Jose has to get to work. So he has to be able to drive. And then one of the commissioners said to me, have you no compassion? And the more I talked and the more the defense of them driving was all, oh, they pay taxes. Oh, they're the safest drivers. They provide so much to the economy. And I do have a background in market research and statistical analysis. So I started doing research and I was like, this is not true. And if I have to defend why these people shouldn't be driving because they pay taxes, I've got to get into that too. So instead of just talking about how bad drivers they were and why they shouldn't have licenses, I had to defend the fact that everything you're saying about them, which really is irrelevant to whether they should be here or be able to drive, I'm not going to let you say that because it's not true. And then, I started reaching out to other families and people who, when I did get a name, and just, finding one horrific story after another. And the more research I did, the more I found out this is much worse than anybody's talking about, not just the driving, but the illegal immigration. And to add to that, the guy did get convicted, spent all of 43 days in jail. He was released by a sheriff named Ross McElreamy, and if that name sounds familiar, he's the guy who released the killer of Kate Steinle, which allowed him to kill her. And after he was convicted, I met with Henry Waxman, who was my congressman at the time. And I just said, look, I just want to make sure this guy is detained and deported. And this is now into 2012. And he I wouldn't say he was enthusiastic about helping me, but he did write to USCIS and got a response back that the guy would not be detained and would not be deported because, and this is an exact quote, he's only committed one crime of moral turpitude. Government speak for, oh, he's only killed one person, what's the big deal? I didn't find out till later, and I had actually already met with him for a different reason, but whose policy was that? Who was in charge of USCIS at the time? Mayorkas.
Wow.
And the one thing that I would say, this issue, it's the same crappy, disgusting people from Gavin Newsom to Kamala Harris to George Gascon to Ali Mayorkas. It's the same people you see over and over and over again that first contributed to my son's death. And I really do blame those first three more than anybody else because they had multiple opportunities to deal with this guy before he killed my son. And I do want to add, he was not a criminal in the sense of the word, of harming people, breaking into houses. He was 51 years old at the time. And he probably fit that description of he came to the country, make a better life. But he did that by constantly breaking laws. I mean, he drove every day, even after he got caught driving without a license. They didn't prosecute him. They didn't do anything. So he kept doing it. And that's why I blame Gascon was the police chief at the time. Newsom was the mayor of San Francisco, and Kamala Harris was the district attorney. They basically rewarded the guy for breaking the law. So why wouldn't he continue to do that? So I finally did get him deported. It took me 8 months to get the guy deported, fighting everywhere along the line. And eventually got him deported, which didn't really make me feel much better, because when I know he didn't go out that day saying, I think I want to kill somebody. But when I see these guys that do those kind of crimes and get protected and don't get deported, I mean, that's really frustrating and really angers me that we allow that to happen.
Don, why do you think it is that so many people sort of brush this off and act like it's, they just broke the immigration law? I mean, if you think about this, for so many other crimes, somebody who was a victim would wind up having, a movie made about the crime on Lifetime. And this is something that everyone forgets this, but you just raised a really important issue. This is a person who repeatedly broke the laws of the United States, not just driving without a license, not just entering the country unlawfully, but working in the United States. There's a whole package of law breaking that goes on here. And yet, as you pointed out, we're rewarding people for this rather than enforcing the law as it should be. So why do you think that is?
Well, a lot of it, obviously money is a big part. Both politicians and some businesses, they benefit by lower wages and even driving wages down. Even if they don't hire illegal aliens, the wages for those workers are driven down. So, I mean, that's the easy part. The other part is the public just doesn't know. The public has been presented with a picture that, all of these people are fleeing certain death, and they want to come here and they work hard and they contribute. And look, it's true. Many of them do work very hard. But, when they say, they pay taxes so they contribute. And, you guys know from the FAIR report, yeah, they pay taxes, but we pay more than 10 times as much to support them. And that never gets discussed. And when they, and I have noticed, I mean, when I started doing my research, even on just the driving, there was a lot more coverage of people who were killed by illegal aliens driving. It never gets covered anymore. So, and the crimes they commit never get covered. We just saw what happened, in Texas, where that family of 5 was murdered. And I've been following a lot of the news media. Many of them are not even mentioning that the guy who killed them was illegal. And, and I do think that, Governor Abbott was wrong in labeling the victims right then and there as being illegal. But the issue has been turned over to one of, Abbott's a jerk because he labeled them as illegal. And it's a gun issue. It's not an illegal immigration issue. I mean, if you took away all the guns, the guy could have gone in, killed him with a knife. I was just reading a story. It was Serbia, but a 7th grader had Molotov cocktails, went into a school. This just happened. I mean, killed with handguns 7 other students, or 8 maybe, but he had on him Molotov cocktails. Well, this guy could have gone to that house in the middle of the night, thrown a couple, Molotov cocktails and killed everybody in the house. But if he wasn't in the country, he couldn't have hurt anybody. That would be like me blaming Chevy because the guy was driving a Chevy when he killed my son. Well, no, that's, if he wasn't here, it wouldn't have happened. But, one of the things, and just to give you an idea on the public and their thought process on this, this was a Harvard Harris survey that came out in December. They were asking just people about immigration or excuse me, illegal immigration and the numbers. And I was shocked when I saw it. They asked how many border crossings by illegal immigrants do you think are occurring each year? 87% weren't even close to the number, ranging from less than 100,000 a year, and then the upper end of the ones that didn't get it right, between 1 and 2 million. So some were close. 75% were off by 100%, and 55% were off by 1,000%. Now, where do they get that information? They don't get it from you. They don't get it from FAIR. They don't get it from numbers. They don't get it from Fox News. They get it from MSNBC, CBS, ABC, CNN, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the LA Times. They're flat out lying to them. Could be lies of omission, but so you have a public that thinks that illegal immigration is wrong, but the people who come here are good people that just are looking to better their lives, and we should allow them to stay. And a poll that was done by the LA Times and YouGov in December, 50% of the people thought that most to all of the asylum seekers were valid. What's the number? 14%? But so until the public learns the truth, nothing's going to change.
Don, what was the coverage in the media, either in San Francisco or in the whole state of California, after Drew's death, and what was the tone of it? How did they sort of frame it?
Well, probably because, and I don't really blame them for this because of how it came about. I mean, the coverage the next day in the San Francisco Chronicle was a 1-inch story that a 25-year-old law student was killed in a traffic collision, and that was it. Now, again, at that point, they wouldn't have known that the person was illegal. I mean, I did end up doing a couple of radio shows down there, but it was months later down the road. So there was really no coverage at all, other than that, little notation that the guy was killed. But like I said, back then, when I started doing my research, there were a lot of stories in the news media. John Smith was killed by Jose Garcia in a traffic collision. Garcia's in the country illegally. Now that is as close to zero as you can be. It just doesn't. Even I guess it was a couple years ago when the guy who was in Texas driving and he killed 4 motorcycle riders and injured 9. That appeared in the Houston Chronicle because it happened near Houston, and the Chicago Tribune because the 4 people that were killed were from Chicago. It did not appear in one major newspaper or in any broadcast media other than that. And look, the LA Times so far, and I say that because that's where I'm closest to, they haven't identified the killer, the murder of those people in Houston as being here illegally. I mean, yesterday they had one story about it, didn't mention it. They had a couple letters to the editor, not about that story, the letter writers didn't mention it. And they had one columnist who wrote a story and didn't mention it. So if you live in LA and watch MSNBC, you probably have no idea, although I do want to say that MSNBC did cover it a little, but the ones that covered it, again, turned it into a gun story. So the public they either don't know, they get misinformation, or they get, no information at all. And now these stories just, if it's an auto collision and it's horrific enough, They may write the story, but they won't identify. A lot of times they'll say the driver's identity was not known at press time. And I know that it was because I got the same press release they did, because you can tell the way they wrote their story. It was from the press release. They just lie about it and leave it out. Even the story I was just telling you about, the LA Times YouGov study, they wrote a story about the study. And a lot of the questions were very abstract, but obviously the one about asylum was, very objective. We know what the numbers are. They didn't even mention it. So basically they're reinforcing misinformation. They should have said, even though 50% said this, the true number is, in this case, 14%. I mean, just for a little background, although I was in the entertainment industry, the last 15 years of my career, I was in publishing and trade shows, again, for the entertainment industry, but I know publishing. And the biggest magazine that I published, our expertise was market research and statistical analysis. So I have the journalism side and the research side, and it's abysmal the way this is done. And it's probably that way for many other subjects, but this is mine.
It almost seems like it's a coordinated effort, if you didn't know any better, that local politicians enable it, they barely prosecute it, and then the media does their part by sweeping it under the rug so the public is largely uninformed about the problem or the scope of the problem, and it just gets worse and worse.
Oh, well, it is. It's not, it doesn't seem like it. Absolutely is. I have no doubt in my mind. And I can tell you, when right after Trump got elected, he hadn't been inaugurated yet. This was like 2-3 weeks after. The LA Times writes an editorial, and the headline is, "In the war against immigration, the first victim is the truth." And in the story, they lied. So they were correct, and the lie was that crossing the border is not a crime. This is what the editorial of the LA Times is saying. And at the time, he was the editorial, editor of the editorial page. I wrote him, and one of the few guys at the LA Times that will communicate with me. And I said, "You're wrong here." I sent him a link to the law. Don't hear back. A couple of weeks later, they write a story, and this was just, a news story about this woman who was being deported. And, she had only written a few bad checks, although they were wrong on all of that. But in her story, she said that crossing the border, is a crime, and she cited the thing. And then I wrote back to both of them and a few other people, said somebody's right here and somebody's wrong. And eventually, they admitted they were wrong. They refused to print a correction in the newspaper. Well, we'll put it online. So who the hell's going to see it online unless they go to your editorial? So it never ran. So everybody who read it believes that crossing the border is not a crime, and that was purposeful.
Tom, this brings up something interesting, and I wanted to go back to this. So you had mentioned earlier that the man who killed your son got a letter from USCIS, and they said they weren't going to deport him because he only had one crime involving moral turpitude. Now, that's not the law, correct? That was the policy of Alejandro Mayorkas.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that was absolutely. And the guy who wrote the letter, and I was read the letter by Waxman's office. They would not send it to me. And the guy, and I think he may still be there. And I again, if he's following policy, I'm not besmirching him. I think it was a guy named Jim McKevitt, if you know that name. I mean, he was the guy who wrote the letter. And one of the things in the letter was that there was, these people have privacy rights. And I did write McKevitt back and cited the Privacy Act and said, they're not covered by what you're claiming. Here's the act. And then he wrote back that, oh, well, there's policies. And it's like, well, you can't make a policy that violates the law unless the law says you can write a policy about it. So they were just playing their own games. And certainly once, Trump became president, and there's people that I know that, some political appointees, some that work there, they've said, the policy wonks have gummed up the work so bad that people can do almost anything and get away with it for some amount of time. But yeah, that was, and the way that, the irony behind the policy, the guy who killed my son did get temporary protective status. I mean, he came into the country illegally, he got temporary protective status. And the law for that was 2 misdemeanors or 1 felony. He was originally charged with, and at the time I didn't know about TPS, he was charged with a felony vehicular homicide hit and run. The charge was reduced to a manslaughter, which makes it a misdemeanor. And a lot of things were happening over time, and I was like, why? Why is this happening? When the guy who called me to tell me he was illegal told me about his TPS and explained it to me, all of a sudden it made sense. He was convicted of driving without a license, which in California is a misdemeanor. And even though the vehicular manslaughter charge it's also a misdemeanor, 2 misdemeanors, you're supposed to be deported if you have TPS. But as I did research, I discovered that they decided that driving without a license was not a big deal. So they weren't going to count that as a misdemeanor. And I will tell you, this is before I knew Mayorkas was behind this. I met with him in 2014, and I asked him a simple question, and it really wasn't an immigration question. I said, do you believe that a crime that kills over 7,500 people a year is a serious offense? Because that's how many people were getting killed by illegal aliens in that time period. He wouldn't answer the question. And, liar, scumbag, psychopath, he's all of those things. And I tell you, I left that meeting with him, I almost had the shivers, because there's just something about me. You can see just when you look at him talk. I don't know what it is. I'm not a physician. I'm not a psychiatrist. Something wrong with him. And later on, like I said, I found out that it was his policy because he was in charge at the time. When I met with him, he was the assistant secretary of DHS.
I worked with Eli Mayorkas, and Brian's heard me say this before. The guy has the moral compass of a Soviet gulag guard. And what you're talking about, I have significant experience with. I was a trial attorney with ICE and an immigration judge, and there seems to be this belief that when it's immigration law, you can just ignore the law at will. So the individual that was responsible for your son's death, there didn't need to be anything other than the fact that he was unlawfully present in the United States to remove him. And TPS is not a permanent, irrevocable grant. And so within the TPS statute, there is a requirement that 1 felony or 2 misdemeanors, but there are also other provisions that allow TPS to be stripped when somebody has committed a crime or engaged in other acts. It just takes someone within the machinery to actually make a decision to do it. And I think what's most terrifying about this is you now have the government of the United States putting the interests of foreigners ahead of the interests of American citizens in order to keep people who have committed crimes in the United States. That's terrifying.
Well, as you know, in the past 2+ years, whether it's Biden or Mayorkas, when asked, well, Biden never talks about it, but when Mayorkas is asked, his comments are always, we're trying to create a safe and humane system for asylum seekers. He's never once, and no one in the administration has ever said, we're trying to protect Americans from illegal alien crime. It's not even an afterthought. It's not a thought at all. And, look, he made that statement, being in the country illegally is not grounds for deportation. Well, yes, it is. And I don't know if are you guys aware of what just happened in San Mateo, California?
Sure, please.
Well, matter of fact, I learned about it the night before the vote from something I got from FAIR. And I, quickly did some research at night, looked at the thing. Well, in San Mateo, an ordinance, California's a sanctuary state, but there are exceptions where you can, work, you can notify ICE and work with ICE under certain crimes. San Mateo commissioners, and they passed it, even though, I wrote to them, but no response. They will now not cooperate. It's forbidden for anyone in San Mateo to cooperate with ICE, even if it's a murder, a rape, or child molestation. So you can commit a crime in San Mateo, and you cannot be, reported to ICE under any circumstances, no matter what that crime is.
Well, the reason they chose those particular 3 crimes to mention is because in the very first section of Immigration Nationality Act 101 A43, which sets out what an aggravated felony is, the very first paragraph says that murder, rape, and sexual abuse of a child are an aggravated felony. They're a basis for deportation, and they're also a basis for a permanent bar from ever coming to the United States again. And so this is an example of state governments not wanting to work with ICE to permanently bar people. And we should also point out that both being a sanctuary city and these kind of ordinances are completely illegal. As part of a basic concept of federalism, a state or municipality can't simply refuse to recognize and obey federal law.
Well, we often, I'm sorry, Don, we often cover the issue of the 287G cooperation agreements. And Don, your group's involved with Early's project group on a case in Oregon. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, we get I get contacted a lot and send it to the board on, on these cases and, filing an amicus brief. And when it's a similar thing that if you're, and although a little bit in reverse, we're going to try to protect American citizens. Well, we're not going to let you. And that's what's kind of happening there. So, we want to do as much as we can on these things, and a lot of it is, we can file the amicus brief and whatever, but now it's good for us too, because it does give us credibility to talk about these issues when we do, to speak to the media that, here's what we're doing right now. Obviously we don't write them. We don't have any attorneys and anything like that, but we're very thankful that, that these people are doing it. But the main thing is, again, going back to the, earlier part of the conversation, it's getting people to be aware of the anti-cooperation laws that are being passed. Because when you have that conversation, one-on-one or one on a few to people, they're pretty shocked. Most people, if you talk to them just about sanctuary in general, or even, this case in Oregon, they don't believe what you're telling them. They think that, well, sanctuary isn't to protect a criminal, it's to protect my gardener, my maid. And it's like, no, it's just the opposite. It doesn't really protect them at all. It protects criminals. And, so again, we'll support this. We're out talking about it when we do talk to people. And if we do get on stations, I'm very curious to see how the court decides on it. But, we're always willing to do this. And even, I wasn't asked in this case. I've tested kind of COVID, obviously crunched that for a while, but I would go to Oregon right now if the court would, wanted me, if there was if there was going to be testimony on it. We'll do anything we can to get the message out, and that's why we're, working with Early on this case.
I'm Tom Homan. The Biden administration is reversing America's progress on immigration, reversing ICE's ability to deport criminal illegal aliens, reversing job protections for Americans, and construction of the wall. That's why I've joined Early. the Immigration Reform Law Institute. Early uses the courts to stop bad immigration policies. Join me. Support Early at early.org. Help win the immigration fight in the courtroom. Paid for by the Immigration Reform Law Institute.
What's the issue in that case? It involves deportation of non-citizens who've committed crimes there?
Well, yeah, the city, I forgot the name of the city here, but city of College Grove, wants to cooperate with law enforcement, and a group, the Rural Organizing Project, is suing them, saying, you're violating state law, you can't do this, which again is just, amazing that people would want to protect criminals regardless of their immigration status. But there are groups that, that want to do that. So, again, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know how this is going to go, but, banning law, in a nutshell, the case is banning law enforcement officers from cooperating with other agencies. And again, when you look at what just happened, with the case in Texas, it was cooperation between the sheriff, the FBI, ICE, or Border Patrol in this case, that helped, solve this case so quickly. And I can't think of any, whether it's a business or government, where cooperation is a bad thing. But somehow when it comes to illegal immigration, cooperation is bad. The guy who introduced
correctly, the town wants to cooperate. ICE would probably come in if they were asked to come in, but an activist group is blocking that from happening?
Yes.
Unbelievable.
Well, they're suing the police, the city of College Grove and the police department. I guess that's all in one. Because they're saying you're not enforcing Oregon. In Oregon, it's called the Sanctuary Promise Act. You're promising to protect criminals. What a wonderful piece of legislation.
Don, do you know of any other legislation in any other area that protects people under state law from federal enforcement?
Well, I'd have to go look at the list of sanctuary. In a lot of cases, there's just policy. They never, converted to a law. But I know it's more than just California here. Oregon, Washington State has, sanctuary law. But it's hundreds of, I think, like 600 cities and counties. Obviously throw a few states in there that have the law. And then there's a lot of, I found over the years when I'm dealing with a victim where the jurisdiction doesn't have any stated sanctuary policy, but they're acting in the fact that they do, even if they don't. So it's.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but this only applies to immigration, right? They're not doing this. There's no tax sanctuaries or fraud sanctuaries.
Yeah, no. I know. I was hearing and I don't know whether they went. That I guess some jurisdictions were trying to do gun sanctuary things, but it's pretty big. And the San Mateo case, when the guy was being interviewed, the guy who introduced the ordinance by it was TV broadcast interview, his comment was that the person if they're reported to ICE after they've been convicted, they're being punished twice. And when I wrote to him, I said, what are you talking about? They're being punished. Yes, they molested a 3-year-old, so they're being punished for that. But they're here illegally, so they're being punished for that. They're not being punished for the molestation twice. But the mindset of so many people is that, they've had their punishment, so now they should be free to go. He even likened it to citizens. Well, citizens don't get punished. Well, they would if they had another crime, but they don't have another crime.
Well, and that's based on this very paternalistic presumption that somehow sending someone back to the country where they were a citizen and lived for years is a form of punishment. And I've never understood that. I mean, most of these people, even a lot of the illegals, believe it or not, will go home on vacation and then sneak back into the United States.
Yeah.
And so this whole notion that somehow sending you to your native country, many of which are places where Americans regularly go on vacation, is somehow a punishment strikes me as beyond absurd.
Well, the example, you're right. I hear that a lot. And the example that I would always use is if I steal a car, returning the car is not the punishment. The punishment is either I'm going to go to jail, I'm going to pay a fine, whatever it is. But returning what's not yours is not punishment. And coming here illegally is not your right to do. So you're not being punished for that. And you'd be punished. And a matter of fact, and if somebody gets into the conversation deeper, it's like we could punish you with 6 months in jail, or I don't know what the amount of money is, fine. We're not doing that. We're just saying we're going to send you home. We're not going to punish you. And maybe that's, I mean, I know the numbers are so crazy, it would be hard, but that's maybe part of the problem. That, like, again, back to the same guy, came in at least 4 times. Why wasn't he jailed? So he was sent out of the country 4 times. He was never punished for breaking the law. He would have been punished had they done what they should have done and thrown his ass in jail for a couple of years, which would also probably stop other people from coming if they knew, well, if they catch me, I could spend 10, depending on the crime, to 20 years in jail. I'm not going to take that chance anymore.
Don, where can people learn more about AVIAC and what can they get from your content?
Well, we do have a website. It's AVIAC, AVIAC.us. So you got to make sure they know the .us. They can do that. From that point, they can contact any of the board. They can contact me. If they'd like, throw a little commercial in here, they could make a donation. We're a 100% unpaid group. If anything, we spend money out of our own pocket to travel and do things. So, we're always open for tax deductible contributions. But, and I will respond, I respond to, or another board member, but it's usually me. But anybody who writes us will get a response. And most of the time I'll even send them my phone number and have a conversation. Because a lot of the contacts that we get are somebody who either knows someone who just had a tragedy happen to them, or it's happened to them. So yeah, we very anxious. Again, that's aviac.us, and within 48 hours they'll get a response.
I can tell you, Don, before we came on the air, I was on your site, and it's amazing to me all the personal stories on there. True stories on there, but many, many others. And you hear these statistics thrown around in the news. And when it's just a statistic, there's a tendency to just gloss over it. When you see that these are real people, these are the children of people, these are the fathers, the mothers, the brothers, sisters of people who lost their lives. And a lot of times, like you say, it's minimally covered in the press, if at all. It's really, it hits you reading these stories. So yeah. I would encourage people who want to learn more, go there and read about these stories.
Yeah, I'll tell you, it was either 2015 or 2016, I don't remember. Let's see, Kate Steinle was killed in 2015, I think. Yes. So it would have been 2015. I mean, first, just to show you how bad the media coverage even was, I was with my wife and 2 kids in the Arctic Circle on a vacation. There's no cell service, there's no internet service, but every day it was a small ship of about 100 people. They print this little newsletter that they would pick up from radio communication that they had. And my younger son was reading it, and he says, "Oh, I don't want you to see this." And I'm like, well, now I want to see it. And I mean, this was literally one 8.5 by 11 piece of paper folded over. And the story on the back was Kate Steinle being killed. I knew about that in the Arctic Circle. Once I got back and started checking news, I knew about it in the Arctic Circle from this thing before the news was covering it. But a few weeks later, I was asked to testify in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee on, my son's thing and other people. And there were too many of us there. I mean, so they only had 5 of us testify. One was Kate Steinle's father. There were 2 Sacramento sheriffs who had been literally assassinated right around that time. The wife of one was there. And I kind of understood, okay, I understood my story isn't as graphically disgusting as these other ones and as timely. So, I did file, a paper on it, but didn't get to testify. But I'm sitting there, and my one concern that I did talk to the committee, the staff person a couple days before, is that you're going to have 5 witnesses. They're each going to talk about their story. Somebody has to talk about the story because people view it as one-offs. And sure enough, there was a pastor there from New York who was testifying, for the other side. And he made a comment, during his presentation, don't blame all of these people for what a few have done. Now, you can't see this, but after the hearing adjourned, C-SPAN cameras were still rolling. So it picked up the audio, but it didn't pick up the video. And I walked up to him and, you can't see me. I'm 5'10", 5'11" on a good day. Not a big threatening guy. I'm 70 now, so I was 60 something then. And I walked up to him and said, dressed nicely in a suit and tie, and said, and not one senator asked him to define few. So I said, how many people do what is few? How do you define few? And this is a pastor, with a very ugly face, he says to me, few, right in my face. And then you can hear me as I start yelling at him. I said, few, thousands, tens of thousands have been killed. That's a few. And now the hearing was adjourned. The next thing I knew, I had 2 Capitol Hill police standing next to me asking me to leave. I walked out. One guy came running out, Capitol policeman, cuff him. They handcuffed me. They were going to arrest me. Now, I hadn't broken the law. I didn't threaten the guy or anything. The hearing was adjourned, so I wasn't interfering with the hearing. And they, once they took me down to the paddy wagon, but they didn't arrest me. They took the cuffs off. But that's the problem. When we talk about one story at a time, the public mindset, well, that's horrible, but. And, the question that I've asked a lot is what's an acceptable ratio of American deaths to illegal aliens being in the country? And of course, it's 0. There's no acceptable ratio for that. But that's what happens. And I do blame, as I like to say, those who have come in and are, they quote, otherwise law-abiding. They are accessories before the fact. If they weren't here, would there be sanctuary cities just for criminals? No. Would they have, Gavin Newsom, a year before my son was killed, told illegal aliens, you can drive, we will not we will not prosecute you? Would he have done that if there were 300 illegal aliens in San Francisco instead of 10,000 or whatever the number is? No. So even though they're not acting purposely, and I know it's not legally, it's not an accessory before the fact, but morally it certainly is, because they're contributing to the policies, the corruption of the government. Would they be fighting, these laws if the only people in the country were like the guy who just murdered those people? No. They're doing it for the quote, otherwise law-abiding. And that's what leads to this. So we're talking, I don't know if you guys have ever looked at the SCAP reports and the GAO reports on criminal, the numbers are out. The the last report was 2018, I think they released it, was they were responsible for over 33,000 deaths. It's like, is that not enough of a number? So yeah, when you just get it, when you're fed in drops, it doesn't impact you until you're the drop.
And we're almost out of time. Is there anything else you want to add in closing?
Well, I mean, I would just say, you guys got to keep doing what you're doing. We really appreciate it. The main thing is getting the message out and getting people to know, because the one thing, and one last anecdote to this, I was the only, when California in 2013, and actually it's a good subject also because it's important information, when they were debating, put quotes around debating because they didn't debate it, the driver's license law, I was originally, before they did that, I would have supported that because logically it makes sense. You get a license, you're a better driver. But I did a lot of research and found out that that wasn't true. And when I went, here's a state, 39 million people. I was the only person to testify against the driver's license law. But what was interesting about it, and I've done this in other states, they all pass it saying it'll make the roads safer, and it doesn't. Every state sees massive increase in traffic fatalities. But what was interesting, the LA Times, and I can only speak to them again because that's paper I get every day at the time, they never even had an article that there was this law to be passed. But after it was passed, they did a survey, which they should have done obviously before. Of the entire population, over 60% were against driver's licenses for illegal aliens. But what shocked me, 53% of Hispanics were against driver's license for illegal aliens. And what I learned from that, and one other time testifying, is we shouldn't paint all Hispanic, and they do. They get painted with a broad brush that they're all guilty, even when they're, they could be 5 generations here, but they have an Hispanic surname. And many of them are on our side. Now, many of them can't speak out because they have a family member here illegally, even though they don't like it. I mean, my gardener, who I knew for 30 some years, unfortunately passed away. He came here illegally, was given, as a teenager, was given amnesty in the 86 amnesty. He wouldn't talk to some of his family that came years later because they were here illegally. He wouldn't hire anybody who was illegal. He said, I was wrong. I should have never done that. I was a teenager. I came to work. I intended to go back. They offered me amnesty. I took it, and here I am. But I know it's wrong. And I've heard that from so many Hispanics. But they are afraid to speak out. So it's really important that we get as many people knowledgeable about the subject, and they're much more knowledgeable because they're more often than not the victims. Because the people that are here illegally all live in the same place, but it's hard to do. So the main thing is it's got to be the education. There has to be pressure. The public has to put pressure on politicians, particularly in purple, if they're in purple areas, that this is bad for everybody. And, I'll support you, but you got to change your position on this issue. And that just doesn't happen. So that would be the last thing that I would say. We have to just keep pounding away at educating the public, because, watch any of these hearings, Homeland Security, Judiciary, every Democrat, they either don't know what they're talking about, flat out lying, or have a lot of misinformation, because they talk about this subject. And I sit there watching these hearings, I'm going, that's just not true. You can have your opinion that you think we should let these people in, but the reason and the rationale you're giving me is not true. So it's really truth. That's my message. Get the truth out.
Okay. Don Rosenberg, president of AVIAC, thank you so much for joining us, and come back anytime.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll do it every day.
Okay, take care.
Thank you.
Thanks. So, Brian, that's some pretty potent stuff. I've talked to Don a number of times, and I never cease to be amazed at one, his amazing way of looking at this whole situation, and number two, the tragedy that he underwent.
It's heartbreaking. It shows the strength of that guy and the strength of all the angel parents and family members who have had to carry on, but they are just doing such great work because rather than just sort of wallowing in their grief, they're trying to create conditions where other people won't have to go through what they went through.
And the other thing about it is it's not just a knee-jerk reaction against anyone who is here unlawfully. I mean, they're taking a look at the genuine problem, which is that unlawful migration brings with it a host of other crimes, whether it's identity fraud through the use of fake social security numbers, driving without a license, all of these different issues that come up.
And he said it at the end there with regards to the driver's licenses. Allowing that on the scale that they're doing now is dangerous to everyone. It's dangerous to them too, the people who are driving like that. So again, it's not just, oh, you're mean to certain people, you don't like certain people. We're talking about a public safety threat. That's it.
Well, and you're also talking about, if you go and give people who have broken the law the same privileges, and driving is privilege, it's not a right, that you give to people who obey the law, then you wind up undermining the law. I mean, there is absolutely no reason why, if you don't have a right to be here, you should be able to drive in the United States. But this has been a consistent theme with the anti-borders progressives that, oh no, this is somehow a better situation because it, brings people into the fold. They come and they register and they become better drivers because they have to be registered and insured and all this kind of stuff. And, Don had mentioned that he had done research and found that was not true. And back when I was at Fair, Spencer Rayleigh and I did research on this as well. In fact, it does not tend to be true. Of course, if you think about that, if licensing drivers inherently made them safer, we wouldn't have the large number of car accidents that we have every year in the United States.
I've spoken to Don several times over the years. I learned several things from that interview, but one thing I had not heard from him before is that in San Francisco, at the time his son died, the city was being led by Gavin Newsom, Kamala Harris, and George Gascon. That's sort of like the unholy triumvirate from hell there, isn't it? I mean, that town doesn't have a chance.
It is. It's like, the Father, Son, and the Holy E. Kamala Harris is one of the singularly most untalented lawyers. She was a terrible prosecutor. I don't know if she was a particularly great politician. And she's been a horrible vice president. I mean, Joe Biden made her the border czar. And I think she got within 200 miles of the border and never took a serious look at it. Gavin Newsom is one of these ideological politicians who thinks he knows better than everyone else, which was demonstrated by his behavior during the COVID pandemic. He's telling people they can't celebrate Christmas or Thanksgiving with their families, and he was at the French Laundry unmasked with a bunch of his friends and political cohorts. And Gascon is just a horrid wretch of a human being. I mean, this is an individual with background in law enforcement prosecution who doesn't think that it's his job to put bad guys in jail. It's worse than the unholy trinity. It's the unholy trinity of evil intention combined with abject stupidity, which never ends well for anyone.
It's also naked opportunism. Didn't Kamala Harris, at the time she was DA there, crack down severely on cannabis users there, but goes easy on cases like this that we heard described to us? I mean, if anything, it should be reversed. the things that are directly killing people should be your priority.
Well, when she was a prosecutor, she needed to crack down on something in order to make it look like she was taking her job seriously. Fortunately, she was a prosecutor at a time when the Chesapeake game plan was not acceptable. Now we seem to have these people that go into prosecution thinking it's their job to find ways not to apply the law to people who commit crimes. And in effect, the immigration issue is just an extension of that. And so you have the Biden administration selectively choosing which portions of the immigration law that it wants to enforce or not enforce. And it's let 7.5 million people into the United States. And, I think Don, in some ways, is too kind in his analysis of what happened to his son. He said in his interview with us that individual did not fit the definition of a criminal, except that I think illegal aliens do. I mean, Art Arthur over at Center for Immigration Studies wrote a great piece called The Myth of the Otherwise Law-Abiding Illegal Alien. And he pointed out in that, and Don pointed this out too, but I think Don is a nice guy, and he tries to be fair and balanced. But Art pointed out that when you come into the United States unlawfully, it's not possible to be otherwise law-abiding, because if you want to work, you then have to break the law. If you apply for any benefits, you then have to break the law. If you want to do anything that requires you to give identity documents, like fly in the interior of the United States, things like that, you then have to break the law. So it's this whole cascade. And once you form that relationship of, we're going to come into the country unlawfully, and we're going to live in the shadows. My experience when I was working for ICE was that an illegal alien living someplace in, say, New York City finds it much easier to commit a crime when a neighbor says, listen, I got a package I want you to deliver. I'll give you $500 to get on the train and take this over to New Jersey. Don't ask any questions. Someone like you or I gets hit with a request like that, we go, man, something doesn't sound right. If you're working in the shadows, $500, $500, you're not part of the system. And I saw that consistently when I was a trial attorney. With ICE, you would find people who otherwise should not have fallen for things like that would get caught up in it and then get arrested and be facing criminal consequences. And they would whine about it. Oh, I'm a victim here. And it's like, no, you're not a victim. You're a person who has participated in a chain of crimes to get into the United States and to remain here. And I swear it is a gateway, the way that some scientists think that marijuana can be a gateway drug to other harder drug use. I think that once you cross that line as an illegal alien, you may come in and you may never do anything else other than the things that people do, like work unlawfully, use somebody's social security number. Those are crimes. Admittedly, they're not terrible crimes. But I think once you start that chain, it becomes much, much, much easier to start moving on to more difficult criminal behavior.
The things that Don talked about illustrated this too, that these agenda-driven prosecutors, mayors, district attorneys, they work almost hand in glove with the media because they go soft on the perpetrators. The media either pretends that these things don't exist, or they give it the sugar-coated treatment so the public stays largely uneducated about it. And then it just perpetuates over and over. I mean, how many times do you see now cases of crimes being committed where you can just see and hear in the writing of the article that the writer just trying to massage it and twist it and leave out little facts so that important details are left out. Like, is this person here illegally? Did they have a criminal record? Have they ever been deported? Those things are all kind of, if they're mentioned at all, they're pushed way to the bottom of the article.
It happens all the time. And, one of the things Don mentioned was Governor Abbott, outing, I guess, is the way the media is portraying it, the victims of the shooting in Texas as illegal aliens. I don't think Governor Abbott was outing anyone. I think he was pointing out that this was a status that these people had, as a matter of fact. And I think if you talk to Abbott personally, just from if you observe what he says and interactions that Early's had with the state of Texas, he'd tell you that he thinks that it is relevant because if the shooter wasn't here and the people who he shot weren't here, then we wouldn't have a criminal on the loose that the law enforcement authorities in Texas are looking for, as well as 5 dead people. The whole situation is one that could have been completely avoided if none of the illegal aliens who were involved in it, I said the IA word, right? I'm sorry. I know the tube doesn't like that. But if the unlawfully present individuals who were involved in the transaction hadn't been here at all, then we simply wouldn't have had this situation. And I agree with you. It is like the media is carrying the water for these ideologically motivated prosecutors and other politicians. But I think it's part of the bigger problem too. It's this, I'm okay, you're okay, everything's equal, and if everything's equal, everything's good, nothing's bad, and I don't have to make any moral decisions. And that's a terrible situation because society needs standards. And there was a time when Americans were people who were a rule of law people, and they just believed that you had an obligation as a citizen to obey the law. And that's what I just said, obligation as a citizen. If you don't feel like you're a citizen or you're part of the community, maybe you're just going to choose not to follow the law. And, the fact is that making decisions about things that impact people's lives, particularly moral things, is not easy. I was a judge. I was a prosecutor. So I did at ICE. I prosecuted violations of the Immigration Nationality Act. And occasionally I had to make decisions that didn't make me happy, but they were what was required of me under the law. And when you get into those kind of jobs and you take an oath to support and defend the Constitution, or you're an officer of the court and you've taken an oath before the bar to support and defend the Constitution and uphold the laws of the jurisdiction where you're practicing, what makes you happy becomes irrelevant. Doing the job that you're supposed to do according to the rules by which you are supposed to do it is the paramount issue.
One other thing I would say in closing is that in modern culture today, you read the news, you go on social media, you hear the word victim thrown around so loosely. We have this sort of snowflake culture where anyone who's mildly offended is a victim of this and a victim of that. Hearing Don's story, his son was a victim in the truest sense. Kate Steinle was a victim. Any of those people in those stories on the AVIAC website were victims.
Yeah, Don was a true victim. He doesn't have his son anymore. And that's something that could have been avoided if the individual who ran his son over wasn't here in the first place. And if you look at the situation, why did this individual do what he did and take the actions he did that led to the death of Don's son? Because he wanted to get out and not be held to account for the car accident, because he figured he'd probably get deported if he was found. So here's a guy who has a perfect excuse to do the wrong thing and justifies to himself killing another human being because he wants to be able to stay in the United States. And then the whole system aligned to protect him rather than to get justice for Don and Don's family and for Don's son. That's I don't know, Brian. That's just a frightening situation. I mean, we shouldn't be protecting people who are here unlawfully at all, but we especially shouldn't be doing it when they've committed crimes, particularly crimes that resulted in the death of an innocent law student who was just making his way home from class.
Right. And you heard what he said at the end. He's not getting any money for this. He's not doing it to get rich. He's doing it to save other parents from having to go through what he went through. And for that, what does the other side do? They call him a xenophobe, a nativist, every other name you can go.
I was shocked when he told that story about the Capitol Police wanted to arrest him because he had the audacity to speak up to a pastor who shouldn't be advocating on behalf of criminals who take other people's lives in the first place. Don had the temerity to speak up when this guy was being untruthful with Congress, and they're looking to punish Don. And nobody says to this pastor, hey, you know what? You got to watch your step here because you're dealing with somebody who has suffered a grievous loss at the hands of someone who was unlawfully present in the United States. perhaps it's incumbent upon you as a man of the cloth to exercise some discretion here. I don't know, Brian. I wonder what's going on with the world.
Challenge the narrative and you get escorted out of the room.
In handcuffs.
Yeah.
Thank you for watching No Border, No Country. If you'd like to support Early's mission, please log on to our website at www.irli.org. There you can find more information about our organization and links to past episodes of the podcast. In addition, you can find us on Buzzsprout. From the Buzzsprout platform, our podcast is put onto a number of different platforms like Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify, where you can hear the audio version. Please stab that like button and subscribe. Thanks again for tuning into No Border, No Country.